what K1BG, this is Bruce, K1VR is Fred. Fred, stand up for a second so everyone sees you. Thank you. And myself did is we said, let's try to see what kind of stuff comes up when you ask about the future of ham radio through AI. Now, I'm a big historian of technology. I'm well aware, for example, of the pulps that were published in the 1930s about the views of the future with the supersonic vacuum tube driven trains and so on, okay? So we all know that predicting the future is kind of taken with a huge caveat. So we're going to give you some of those results today in the context of a huge caveat. Let me tell you the general approach that we took. First of all, the engine that I used was ChatGPT 03, which is a little more advanced than the one that you normally have access to for free. And the general process is asked it some initial questions. Then we asked it to add additional databases. Often these databases come from lateral fields. For example, if you want to find out what might happen to ham radio in the future, you need to go and take a look at A, what's happening in telecom now, and B, what people are forecasting for telecom going ahead. You also want to take a look in the computer field, the optimization field, and so on. So what starts out as basically a super search engine gets to be much more advanced and to bring in stuff from the outside and then to extrapolate based on combining all those data fields. So I concentrated in my part in coming up with the technology end, and it came up with some real wacky results. I'm just going to describe very briefly three of them. One of these came up with an artificial ionosphere based on satellites. Another, it came up with the idea of what it called cordal bandless HF, which means that based on real-time optimization of the link, it was saying, forget about operating on one band versus another band. I'm going to put this wherever I want over the course of 2 or 3 or 4 different bands in real time. And finally, it came up with a very interesting immersion scenario that is sonically based that also, it's almost like a Tony Stark situation. So I'm not going to go into all three of those because we are running out of time, but let me talk about the artificial ionosphere. First of all, it is illegal to directly transmit signals at satellites that may saturate their receivers or transponders and so on. It so happens that most satellites don't operate anywhere near amateur radio frequencies, and you have to accept the fact that there's some very minor reflection that happens from them. That amount of reflection is determined by the so-called radar cross-section, and that changes very dramatically at frequency, but it's basically a function of the wavelength that you're using versus the size of the satellite in wavelengths. What it found was that between Starlink and the programs that are being planned and going to be put up in the sky by China, there's going to be tens of thousands of these satellites in low Earth orbit. And although they have fairly low radar cross-sections, you can get reflections at 2 meters on up. Now, those of you who have a little bit of a memory might understand that the ISS actually was able to impart a transcontinental reflection on 2 meters back, I think, in 2013, 2014. So we know this can happen. The reason it's important now, according to AI, is there are so many satellites up there that even though the reflections are low, the probability of entertaining and seeing them is fairly high. And it came up with a new term for it. It called it sporadic S for satellite. So it claims that sporadic S propagation is going to be a totally new regime for amateur radio operators, passive reflection from satellites moving ahead in the future. Just talking about the last one here, it did something kind of neat. What it said was, why don't we take a monaural signal? And I know what a formant is. If I have several people talking to me on the same frequency, I understand the formants are different. That means I can separate out the different speakers, and by using delays of less than 1/10 of a millisecond, I can actually, in a stereo headphone, spread out the mono signal so the position of the speakers that you're hearing, that is the localization, gets spread out. also can do this for CW. I've actually done some of these experiments with analog, and it works. It's really quite amazing. So it really is putting us kind of in a Tony Stark kind of environment. Well, that's come of this on what happened with some of the technology end. I'm going to ask Bruce K1BG to go into some more general questions about when we asked it about the actual future of ham radio. Very interesting results. Bruce?
Thank you, Chip. So I'm Bruce K1BG. When we started this process, I knew absolutely nothing about artificial intelligence. I have a hard time with natural intelligence. And so we went to ChatGPT, asked it some questions. It was iterative. We asked questions. We asked follow-up questions. And it did a little bit about prediction on the future of amateur radio. I'm just the messenger. I don't necessarily agree with what came back. But I found it really interesting. So basically, it came back and said the following. Amateur radio in 2045 would be a world where the shack lives in the cloud. In other words, pretty much remote operation is kind of the standard, but you don't necessarily stick to one remote station that you use, okay? That the cloud will be full of these remote stations. They looked at current trends, things like remote operation and contesting has now kind of become accepted, but that it'll go mainstream, okay? That there'll be, in the 2030s, there'll be grids of hundreds or even thousands of public shacks that are out there that you can use, okay? And that urban and HOA restricted homes will default to remote HF operation, okay? Station architecture in 2045. ChatGPT came up with this concept of what they call front-end pods. And we asked it, what do you mean by a pod? And a pod is nothing more than a box with all of the, with everything inside it, the station inside it, the software inside it, the algorithms inside it, everything is inside it. You attach power to the pod, you attach an antenna to the pod, you attach a dish to the pod, that will go to some kind of low Earth orbiting satellite for your network connection, okay? And this pod can be deployed anywhere, okay? It can be for your de-expedition, it can be the remote shack. They talked about different types of pods, an HF pod, a VHF UHF pod, a microwave millimeter wave pod, okay? But when I read this, I think in terms of a product where instead of you're integrating radios and antennas and computers and software and all of these things, the pod just does it all, and it's all there for you, okay? So they talk about inside these pods, your waveforms, your ALE, automatic link establishment, okay? Which is a software algorithm where frequencies and those kinds of things are pre-established based on the type of propagation that exists and the kind of connection you want to have. Logging, reporting, all of these are all inside the pod, as is what they call trusted path regulation. In other words, if you're an operator and you access this pod, before you can use it, you enter your call sign, okay? And the trusted path algorithm will determine, is this person licensed to use this frequency? Is this person licensed to use this power? All of those kinds of things are all part of this pod application. Okay, it talked about operating culture in 20 years. Talked about DXing and how these pods will just be deployed in different places around the world, okay? Contesting, They talked about new operator categories, single operator at station versus single operator remote, okay, for potential categories. Awards would be automatically generated. Things would happen kind of in real time, okay? And they talked about youth. They referenced the current remote ham radio program. Everyone familiar with remote ham radio? Yes? Okay. It's a system of remotely, W2RE runs the remote ham radio program. It's remote stations that you can basically become a member of remote ham radio. But for youth, he offers the access to the network for youth free of charge. And ChatGPT talked about youth-style pods, okay, which would be available to youth, okay? And they said this would be the normal licensing lab in high schools. In other words, you have a youth program in high school, okay, and remote ham radio is part of that, and that is what's used hand in hand for getting young people interested in amateur radio. Emergency communications reimagined. What's that? 1 minute. Okay. They talk about how civil defense teams would lease time on pods that could be hundreds of miles away, okay? You have voice gateways and mesh networks in containers, and local volunteers only need a smartphone with a 2-meter, 70-centimeter dongle to access the local pod that's part of an ad hoc network. I don't know if I agree with any of this, but I found the results particularly interesting. Bottom line, by 2045, remote will no longer be an asterisk. It will be the default path into the hobby for anyone who lacks land, low noise, or high budgets. Think about that for a minute. The shack moves to the cloud, the antenna farm to low noise ground, in other words, places where there isn't man-made noise, and the operator, whether a 70-year-old in the country or a 17-year-old on a subway, logs in, clicks Enable Transmit, and meets the ionosphere on his or her own terms. That's the prediction.
Thank you, Bruce.